Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Canada's living standards are falling behind the rest of the developed world. Is this a blip or a real cause for concern? Here to discuss is the Fraser Institute's economic analyst, Alex Whalen. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Tony. Glad to be with you.
Yeah, so this is basically based on a co-authored writing that you did recently and saying that Canadians are indeed falling behind. How do you measure that? Let's ask that question first.
In this study, we use the broad measure of per person GDP, which is a commonly used measure that economists utilize to measure living standards. And we compare Canada to a 30-country panel in the OECD. To answer your question off the top, is it a blip or is it a cause for concern? What the data show us at a very high level is that Canada's performance post-2014 and projected performance out to 2060 is quite seriously a cause for concern.
Yes, no, definitely. That's what I took from your article as well. And I want to describe for our audience a little bit more about GDP versus GDP per person, because obviously there's a discrepancy between those measures. And you hear the Trudeau government, as an example, crowing about our higher GDP and, leading the G7 on GDP and so on. But you're looking at GDP per person. Why the discrepancy?
That's an important point. We use the measure of GDP per person in this study because it controls for population. When you hear the current federal government referring to growth numbers, they're typically using aggregate numbers, so the overall GDP level or the overall level of growth in the economy. But currently, as many of your listeners and viewers would know, Canada's population is increasing rapidly. So what is relevant to the average person is, are they actually better off? So in this study, we use per person numbers, and quite simply, we find that living standards are declining in Canada relative to peer countries.
Right. And so again, I want to make sure we unpack this completely. So peer countries, so you mentioned the 30-country Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. So who would you consider to be the leaders in the OECD on GDP per person?
Yes, as you mentioned in the study, we compare to a 30-country panel of OECD countries. If you look at the 2014 to 2022 period, Ireland was the leader, but unfortunately, Canada actually trailed almost the entire panel during that period.
Really?
Canada was third last, so we trail almost everybody. We trail our key allies and trading partners, for example, in the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as the United Kingdom. So Canada's recent performance has really been quite a cause for concern, and we're trailing virtually all of our peers.
So why is this happening to Canada?
Well, that's a good question, and something we do delve into a bit in the report. I mean, there are a whole bunch of different policy factors and non-policy factors, for that matter, that drive growth rates. But a few that come to mind and that do show up in our research and research conducted by the OECD would be collapse in business investment, growth in the size of government, increase in the tax burden. Overall, Canada has implemented a whole new suite of policies really over the last 10 years or so that have been damaging to growth. And interestingly enough, we do see a break in the trend around 2014, 2015, when we had a change in the federal government and a market shift in federal policies.
Right. So that was the start of the Trudeau government. So basically you're saying since that period, higher taxes and more government is part of the problem here. Is that right?
Yes, and it shows up quite clearly in the data that there is a real divergence that begins in 2014-15. We go all the way back to 2002 in this study, and interestingly enough, in 2002, Canada led the OECD average in per-person GDP by 8.6%.
Okay.
Through Prime Ministers Chrétien, Harper, and Paul Martin, that lead was effectively maintained. By 2014-2015, Canada was leading the OECD by 8.5%, but following 2014 through to 2022, the lead actually completely evaporated.
That's a pretty damning statistic there, indicating that we've kind of gone off course for the last 10 years or so. Alex Whalen, we're going to take a brief break. We'll be back at you after that break. And I want to get into the policy solutions, because clearly we've got an issue that needs to be solved if we're going to have a higher standard of living in the future. So we'll be back with our guest after these messages. Please stay with us.